There is someone in your life who almost never posts. You have noticed it without ever quite articulating it. They are on the platforms, they scroll, they observe, but they leave almost no trace of themselves in the digital record. No birthday announcements, no photos of meals or sunsets or the subtle victories of ordinary life. Just silence where most people manufacture noise. You have probably wondered about it. Most people assume shyness, or introversion, or some vague technophobia that belongs to a different generation. None of those explanations are accurate. What is actually happening inside the psychology of someone who chooses not to post is considerably more interesting than any of those assumptions. And once you understand it, you will never look at digital silence the same way again. Because in a culture that has redesigned human social behavior around visibility, around the performance of existence, the person who opts out of that performance entirely is not making a small stylistic choice. They are making a psychological statement, one that reveals a great deal about how they understand themselves, how they relate to authenticity, and what they have decided their inner life is worth. Part 1. Silence as a form of control. The first thing to understand about people who do not post is that their silence is almost never passive. It is not the absence of something. It is the presence of a specific decision made repeatedly and deliberately in a world that applies constant pressure in the opposite direction. Social media was not designed to be neutral infrastructure. It was engineered by people who understood behavioral psychology well enough to construct environments that make posting feel natural, necessary, and emotionally rewarding. The like button is not a feature. It is a dopamine delivery mechanism. Every notification, every metric, every subtle interface design choice is optimized to reduce the friction between having an experience and broadcasting it. The platform wants you to post. It has been designed from the ground up to want that. So the person who consistently refuses is not simply someone who has not gotten around to it. They are someone whose psychological architecture is resistant to a system that has successfully captured the attention and behavior of billions of people. Research indicates that individuals who refrain from posting frequently score higher on measures of self-restraint, introspection, and emotional independence. They are less susceptible to social comparison and less dependent on external validation to maintain a stable sense of self. In other words, they already know who they are, and they do not need the digital record to confirm it. Part 2. The psychology of psychological ownership. There is a concept in psychology called psychological ownership, the felt sense that something belongs deeply and exclusively to you. A thought, a memory, an experience that shaped you in ways you have not yet finished understanding. And one of the less discussed consequences of posting is what happens to that sense of ownership the moment you do. When an experience is shared publicly, it undergoes a transformation that is subtle but irreversible. It becomes common property, subject to interpretation, to judgment, to the projection of other people's emotional states onto something that was yours. The moment becomes open, and for certain kinds of people with a particularly strong relationship to their own inner life, that opening feels like a loss rather than a connection. This is not irrational, and it is not antisocial. It is a particular sensitivity to the quality of experience. The person who chooses not to post a sunset is not indifferent to the sunset. They are often more moved by it than the person who immediately reaches for their phone. What they are protecting is not the image of the sunset, but the unmediated experience of standing inside it, the moment before it becomes content, the moment that belongs entirely to them. There is something psychologically sophisticated about understanding that not every experience is improved by being witnessed, that some things are most fully themselves when they remain private, that the act of sharing can flatten what it was meant to celebrate.
Part 3. The dopamine loop they stepped outside of. To understand what it costs to not post in the current environment, you have to understand what the alternative actually is at a neurological level. Every time someone posts content online and receives positive feedback, likes, comments, shares, their brain releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in every other reward and addiction mechanism the human brain is capable of generating. The platforms were designed to exploit this. The feedback loop between posting and receiving validation is structurally identical to other behavioral addiction patterns. Variable reward schedules, unpredictable response times, metrics that make the reward quantifiable and therefore endlessly comparable. Over sufficient time inside this system, the brain begins to reorganize its relationship to experience itself. You stop living in moments and start evaluating them for their postability. The internal question shifts from, "What am I feeling?" to, "How would I describe this?" The experience becomes secondary to its representation, and the self that emerges from years inside that loop is a self that has been subtly but profoundly shaped by other people's responses to its performances. The person who steps outside this loop is exercising a form of discipline that most people never have to consciously develop because they were never confronted with a choice clearly enough to make it deliberately. They have what psychologists call a strong internal locus of control. Their sense of worth is generated from within rather than extracted from external approval. They do not need the digital confirmation that something happened to believe it was real. The experience itself is sufficient evidence. Part 4. When silence comes from fear. Not everyone who does not post has arrived there from a position of psychological strength. That is the part of this conversation that demands honesty. For some people, the silence is not sovereignty. It is self-protection. Social media has created and amplified what psychologists identify as self-presentational pressure, the persistent awareness of being observed and evaluated, even in the absence of an actual audience. For individuals with particular sensitivity to social judgment, this awareness is not a background hum. It is a constant foreground presence. The fear is not abstract. It is specific. They worry that what they say will be misread, that what they share will be ignored, that what they reveal will be used against them in ways they cannot anticipate or control. This variety of silence looks identical from the outside to the kind that comes from strength, but it feels entirely different from the inside. It is not peace. It is avoidance. And the distinction matters because the two require completely different responses. The person who does not post because they have decided their inner life is not for public consumption is operating from a foundation of self-knowledge. The person who does not post because the risk of visibility feels too high is operating from a wound that digital withdrawal is not actually healing. It is only keeping out of sight. Both deserve to be understood. Neither deserves to be dismissed with the assumption that silence is simple. Part 5. What they understand that most people don't. The person who has spent significant time outside the posting loop begins to perceive certain things differently. Not better necessarily, but differently in ways that are worth examining. They notice that the urgency to share something is almost always inversely proportional to how fully they are inside the experience. The most profound moments of their life, the ones that actually changed something fundamental, happened quietly, without witnesses, without documentation. Growth, grief, the slow reorganization of a belief system that no longer holds, the moment when something you have been afraid of stops frightening you. None of that makes it to the feed. And after enough of those private transformations, the distinction between what is shared and what is real begins to feel less like a stylistic preference and more like a philosophical position. They also begin to understand something about connection that social media systematically obscures. The connections that sustain them do not require the digital record as evidence. The people who matter to them remember them without the feed as a reminder. They check in without the prompt of a post. They are present in ways that do not require broadcasting. And that quality of connection, unperformed, unbroadcasted, requiring no metrics to validate its existence, feels categorically different from what social media offers. Not just quantitatively less noisy, qualitatively different in kind. Final thoughts. There is a question worth sitting with after all of this. Not what is wrong with the person who does not post, but what it reveals about the environment that makes their silence feel like an anomaly worth explaining. We live inside a system that has successfully convinced billions of people that the primary purpose of an experience is its shareability, that visibility equals value, that to exist without leaving a digital trace is somehow to exist less fully. And in that context, the person who simply lives their life without converting it into content is not making a statement against technology or connection. They are refusing a specific and relatively recent redefinition of what it means to be a person. They understand something that takes most people years inside the system to arrive at, if they arrive at it at all. That the most significant things about a human being cannot be captured in a post. That the self worth protecting is the one that exists when nobody is watching. That privacy is not loneliness, it is intimacy with yourself. And that in a world that has never been louder or more desperate for attention, staying quiet is not a flaw, it is increasingly rare and increasingly necessary.